I'm Mike Hawkes.
And I'm Kevin Spangenberg.
Welcome to In Between Charges, the perfect podcast to listen to whilst waiting for your EV to charge.
We bring you all the information about what happens in between charges, behind your charge points, and behind the scenes of the EV ecosystem.
The role of electric vehicles in a cleaner future is undeniable. Their widespread adoption will lead to cleaner transportation methods and improvements on our air quality, especially in densely populated areas, where dependency on fossil fuels and transportation makes up a significant proportion of all CO2 emissions.
EVs open up a whole new world of opportunities for how we consume, produce, and interact with the energy market. The reason for those opportunities is the technology that EVs come equipped with. These new electrified platforms let designers and engineers rethink the design of the car and how consumers fuel and interact with their vehicles and their homes.
So today, we are joined by Henrik Langeland, the CEO and co-founder of Enode. He will give us a rundown of the current status for transport electrification, the hurdles to reach mass consumption, the role utility companies might play, and Enode's role in connecting all players involved.
So plug in, grab a coffee, and enjoy.
Welcome to this episode of In Between Charges. I'm Mike, and of course, joined by our co-host, Kevin. Say hi.
Hi, Mike. How are we doing today? Really excited for this conversation.
In today's episode, we wanted to explore that a bit more and understand the possibilities that are made available to the driver by moving to an EV, including personalization, deeper participation in that energy consumption, and various other topics. And so to do so, we're very excited. We're joined by Henrik Langeland, CEO and co-founder of Enode. Enode are a software provider and a close partner of Morontus, who builds the digital infrastructure that's required to enable companies of all sizes to create their own and participate in the development of new energy apps and services via Enode's API and a range of other services. And in particular, Enode integrates with and pulls data from the range of different hardware that's involved in the energy transition, from EVs to home chargers, solar inverters, and really centralizes everything through a central channel. So Henrik, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Mike. Excited to be on the show.
Let's go straight into it. So I think we wanted to start with a quote. Greg Ebert, senior manager of the cloud platform architecture at Cariad, which is the automotive software company for Volkswagen. He says, I'll make sure I get this right, when I look at automotive, I equate it to when the smartphone started to become big. Smart cars are essentially that next evolution of technology. And I wondered, as a starting point, Henrik, to what extent do you agree with that statement? And how might an EV now be like a smartphone, or even how might it be very different?
Yeah, I think the transition to electrical transportation is an opportunity for the automotive industry to really take the next leap into new technologies, as you say, right? That's what's happening with all these EVs. They're becoming very sophisticated IoT devices in a way that they haven't been before. And that enables a lot of opportunities. And there's a number of topics, of course, related to that. And, everything from a better user experience in just like owning an EV. But also, of course, what we're really interested in is what that enables when it comes to participation in the energy system in general and taking part in energy transition.
Let's go into that one a little bit more. So the role, I guess, when I think of a smartphone, I think of it as something which is always by my side. It's in my pocket. And for me, then the kind of parallel is I can access everything that I need, communication, whether it's the heating before I get into the car, etc., within the vehicle. And it becomes obviously a very kind of central part of how I interact with the world, how I travel, how I get around. And you mentioned at the end there, so the car as well will play a bit of a closer role in how individuals are consuming energy, but also kind of sharing that back into perhaps, the grid. What are some of the conversations that come up regarding the role of the car when you've been speaking with various OEMs? You, of course, integrate with all of the major manufacturers. What are some of the things that they've been talking with you about, maybe some of the challenges they've had?
I think an overarching kind of challenge or question when it comes to the EV and the role it will play in the energy transition is who's kind of having that interface with the end user. And that's kind of a moving target, I think. And that's where we're going to see a lot of innovation and a lot of things happening and a lot of exciting development.
I think Mike and I were talking about this earlier, where in the home or with the vehicle, there's kind of a real debate and challenge over who gets to own the customer there. Previously, an OEM might build a vehicle, they ship it off to the dealership, and they kind of lose their touch with the customer. Now, with the kind of continuous nature of software, there's a real opportunity for them to be more involved throughout the lifetime of the vehicle ownership. But then you also have a startup such as Monzo or other companies that are involved in that transaction, or Enode that is involved in that space. And then you might have the utility company as well. So could you talk about the challenge there as everybody kind of wants a piece a little bit, and there's a lot of people that are kind of competing, but also interacting when it comes to customer ownership?
That's kind of the crux of the problem. And at the end, we have to build the best end user experience, right? That's what's going to win. Like, who's going to be able to build the best end user experience, and who's going to be able to deliver most value to the end user. And our perspective on that is that you will need some kind of holistic approach to energy consumption in order to be able to take out the full potential of these devices, such as an EV has tremendous potential. But I think that you will need a broader approach to energy management in order to be able to deliver the most value to the end user.
But then I guess maybe to challenge on that a little bit, the business model of an OEM is you are a consumer, you want to purchase the vehicle, and then that's essentially your sale. I appreciate that with software comes greater opportunities to sell new services basically through that platform. But why is this a priority for OEMs? Is it because there is an opportunity out there now? Or is it because they have to provide the best experience relative to a company like Tesla, for example? So now it's basically a chasing game to be able to get up to that level so they can even sell the car in the first place. Do OEMs really want to own that customer? Is it something that they are actually focusing on?
I think that's the big question in all the boardrooms of the EV manufacturers. How does that role look like, and what will they choose, or what's the path they will go down? And it's not obvious that they need to do it, right? But it is clearly an opportunity. It's going to take a tremendous amount of skill and capability to be able to build something like Tesla. Like, Tesla is in a league of its own when it comes to the software capabilities. That's obvious. And I think a comparison would be probably like Apple. As a smartphone maker, Apple is able to build a device that can generate very strong lock-in effects and also sell different devices that are connected to that and build the walled garden. I think Tesla is succeeding in that. They're building solar for the roof. They're building various different hardware components that interact with their Tesla, and they're doing that really well. And I think that's tempting for the other OEMs. But in the end, everyone cannot make this happen. And it's not even clear if they should.
From a charging point of view, you mentioned walled garden for Tesla. We also start to see the same with various different charging networks. Of course, that creates stronger competition and also ultimately a worse experience for a consumer, and trying to solve that and put it all together is what we're looking for. But I kind of also wanted to focus on the OEM a little bit more as well, because completely agree, it's a total transformation of ultimately the product that they're building and putting out into the market. And of course, with more software comes very different maintenance requirements. It's also now the screen that's essentially delivering a very integrated experience with maps, but also with your music player, messages, calling systems, everything else around automated braking systems, how the camera's working and the sensors that's kind of coming out. And then, of course, with software comes the requirement for regular updates being sent over the air, which might be greater security measures if you have your payment systems in place. To what extent are OEMs really prepared for this? And I think willing to invest in either developing that in-house or starting to partner with other companies outside. Toyota and Panasonic being a great example. I wonder if you could comment on that and whether you have had similar discussions with the OEMs that you've been talking about, and perhaps some of the approaches that they might be taking to try to answer that question, whether they should go down this route of owning the customer.
One thing that we've kind of heard at least a number of times is that in the beginning, before you set out on that journey, it might be tempting to wanting to do everything, right? And then you realize down the road, that's going to be really hard. I think that's a little bit what's happening. They're realizing that it's going to be better. They're going to be better off by choosing not to do everything themselves and having focus on what they do best. That's what we're seeing happening. And we're seeing these OEMs now are becoming more and more interested in kind of third-party integrations and making their devices interoperable. And ultimately, the benefits of having a very good interoperable IoT device is that you can capture the imagination and innovation from thousands of other companies. You can be part of something that you cannot do yourself.
I think you hit on a great point there, Henrik, in that the OEMs, amidst this major transition that's happening, their eyes are getting maybe a little bit bigger than their stomach in a sense. But it is a very different thing to build world-class software than to build world-class vehicles. And pertinent example, I guess Monta, we could have developed car integration, but we decided Enode does it a little bit better. And this is what you're focused on every single day. So instead of devoting precious resources and time to doing that, we decided to partner with Enode. And, that's what now we're trying to convince others that they should be using Monta to operate their system. But there's other people, big utility companies want to chart their own path. But I could bake my own bread, but I don't. So shifting a little bit to the connected car, and we were talking about this and we're skirting around it, but we were speaking with another guest recently who works at a major charge point operator in Central and Eastern Europe, was trying to make the comparison to charging to refueling a vehicle at a petrol station and how it should be that simple. And he challenged the premise of that question and was like, well, actually, should that be the way we're thinking of it? Should that be the reference point when it comes to EVs? So as we're all kind of in the midst of transitioning the way we approach our vehicle, charging it, connecting with it, interacting with it, what types of opportunities are you seeing being opened up with EVs and like this connected car, and what will that bring for a consumer?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting topic. And we're in a privileged position here coming from the Nordics and especially Norway, right? Because we're in a place where EV adoption is mainstream and has been mainstream for several years now. And I think an anecdote, it's one we've seen consistently, is, for instance, my uncle recently, he's 70 and just bought a new car, and he's been driving a combustion engine all his life. He hasn't thought a lot about his energy consumption, but suddenly he's thinking about charging his EV in a similar way that he used to think about filling his car, and he's thinking about the price of a kilowatt hour, like he used to think about the price of a liter of gasoline and how it fluctuates and where it comes from. And when people start to do that, that kind of is a spark to their electrification journey. They start to learn about electricity, they learn what a kilowatt hour is, how the price changes, and then they start to think about planning to change his heating to a heat pump because it's more efficient. And then, thinking about solar on his roof because that's going to save you money. So I think that the purchase of an EV, which is generally, at least in Norway, it's not an environmental motivation. It's because it's cheaper and you get a better car for a better price, right? But once you do that, you're going down the path of electrification. And we've seen that so many times and how that really makes people more aware of their energy consumption and more interested in it in a way also.
I really like that way of putting it. Definitely appreciate that everybody is on different stages of this journey with interacting with what the transition to net zero means, what electrification means to them. But I like the way you put it, that for many people, it starts with the purchase of the car. And as you say, I was very curious to understand the motivation behind your uncle as to why you made that purchase. And our theory is very much the same. Yes, it is, of course, participating in reducing their carbon footprint, but is it more about price? And it's actually more as well about just having access to some really cool technology. I guess, what role do you see the car then playing with an individual's energy consumption?
Yeah, I think fundamentally the EV has some properties that really stands out in the household, right? Depending on how much you drive, of course, but it's going to be a substantial part of any household's energy consumption, 30 to 40%, something like that. You have a lot of flexibility onto when you want to charge that battery, which you don't have on, for instance, your heating or other parts of your energy consumption. So it's a very flexible asset, and it's one of the big chunks of your energy consumption. So that makes it fundamentally a very important part of any household's energy consumption.
As we talk about the household a little bit more, the energy consumption, could you maybe speak about your interactions with utility companies and how that connection is working with utility companies here? They're the primary player when it comes to energy transmission and energy production, but utilities are typically known for their speed and pace at which they adopt and transform. We deal with utility companies as well as we try to push them forward, provide data-driven, technology-driven solutions to modern-day problems. Kind of what the main challenges are there.
Yeah, so first of all, the EV is a huge opportunity for the energy providers, right? They've been given an opportunity to become much more relevant than they have been earlier. most of them are really looking to take that opportunity and help their customers use energy smarter. And I think that's really the trend that we're seeing. These energy providers are going from business models that haven't been fully aligned with their customers to business models where they are more aligned. And the EV is a great way of starting that journey. And that's also turning into more competition. And especially, again, in the Nordics, where we are very far on the electrification journey in general, or further than any other part of the world. And I think a lot of what we're seeing here is going to translate to the rest of the world. It's hard to become an energy provider now. Like in Norway, if you don't have smart charging as part of your offering, your customer is going to go somewhere else when they buy that EV, or at least they're going to use Monta or whatever, or like you're losing that interaction. So it's becoming much more important for them to build useful user experiences. So it's very interesting to see how that landscape is shifting as well.
Yeah, that's a great point, is that I hadn't quite thought of that, but the EV unlocks a lot of new opportunities for the utility companies, the energy providers that weren't there previously. Mike and I were mentioning how currently, I don't know about your relationship with your utility provider, but currently you spend about maybe 5 to 15 minutes thinking about your utility provider each year. You get the bill, you pay it, and you move on. And I think there is a real opportunity for energy providers and utilities to kind of transform and evolve. And they're integral already, but maybe evolve themselves to being something that provides more value and opportunity to customers than simply just being a one-way transaction.
And people want more insight, right? So like just as you're not just going blind to the petrol station and filling your car without checking the price. Like you want to know how much you're paying. And that's the way when you're charging at home, people want to know, how much am I paying to charge my vehicle now? Like, is this a good time to charge or is it not?
But I think utility companies realize that they have this dependency with the EV and people purchasing the EV. And so are starting to explore new ways of collaborating with those types of companies. How do they attract somebody in to create a new kind of bundled service? Is that something you're seeing in Norway as one of the countries, the country in Europe, which is leading by a big country mile?
Yeah, so I think that's kind of the second point or important point about the energy provider is that they have similar to your telco, which has a SIM card in their phone, like they have the meter in your house, right? So they have an advantage there. They own the bill that they're sending you. So they have an opportunity there to kind of use that or use that position. And that's kind of an interesting starting point as well. I think the ones that are doing well now are the ones that are aligning their business model with the end user. So like they're decoupling the usage from their revenue. They're just making that kind of a pass-through rate on an hourly basis, spot price rate, so that people have full transparency onto what they're actually consuming.
You picked up on a couple of things. What are the incentives for people to be able to participate in this? How are utility companies going to continue to, provide a base level of service, but participate much more? I think maybe a question from that, we're all looking ahead to 2030, 2035. That's when a lot of the ZEV mandates are coming into play. Fair enough. For Norway, it's much closer, right? 2025. In your opinion, what's actually needed to take the next group of consumers on this journey? Because now we're reaching much more of the mass market.
People are definitely motivated by the environment and helping on the energy transition. But I think that the real action comes when that overlaps with financial motivation as well. So like if you can save money and help the environment, well, then you're definitely going to do something, right? And I think it's our job to make that kind of financial part real, right? There's a lot of ways we can make it even more valuable to own an EV or to connect your devices to an energy management system. We only just started, right?
When you talk about the incentive piece, I was reading last night it was a piece about the current incentive battle, if you'll call it, between the USA and Europe and all the amount of money that's now flowing towards climate tech and green tech. And they called it the race to the top now, as countries now are, and governments, private investors and public investors realize there's a major opportunity to become leaders in this space. And that's why you see such an incredible amount of funding, record year in 2022.
I think an interesting debate as well is this conversation between, we've talked about utilities, yes. We've talked about the EV car, yes. But we haven't yet talked about the smart home. How do you see that? Or can you comment on that from your experience with Enode and maybe your conversations also with the other hardware providers in the space, maybe focusing on that, solar inverters, storage facilities, heat pumps.
As mentioned, the EV is kind of a very key component here, right? In the kind of, if you look at the household and the energy consumption and how that household will play its part in the energy transition, we're going to have an increasing demand for electricity, and we're going to have a much more variable supply. The household need to be able to respond to production in a totally different way than it can today. And the EV is very good at that, but it's also going to need the rest of the household to do that. You need to kind of optimize this holistically for the household, and we'll need to have better price signals. So that's kind of the energy market part of it. But it's, we have to get price signals from the production, from the transmission lines, for the frequency regulation and the distribution. But in order to get there, we have to be able to build technology on top of these hardware devices that are physically installed into every household. That's obviously one of the things that we're working on, and one of the things we believe very strongly is that if we're ever going to be successful in this transition, we need interoperability between all these devices. There's going to be so many different solutions as to how these devices will be operated and how they will be controlled, but they need to be accessible, and it's going to be kind of an evolution. I think a good analogy is the open banking and kind of the fintech journey over the last couple of decades, right? Where you give access to data, right? And you make data available, and you make it possible to build new solutions on top of that data. And in the beginning, it looks kind of trivial, right? Maybe you can just kind of look at your balance in another app, and then suddenly it evolves into a much more efficient and a much better financial system. So I think that's kind of the journey we're going to go through when it comes to energy as well.
Interoperability is the goal. Maybe you're kind of leading us there, but what is the big challenge in achieving interoperability?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I would say the complexity is just tremendous, right? And it's multiplied by the fact that we're dealing with physical devices. So there's so many different edge cases, so many different things that can happen, and so many different variations of different hardware. So it's kind of, our job is kind of unifying all those different variations into a single unified communications protocol, right? Or a unified API. So like actually building something that's reliable and can support a good user experience is really challenging. Hopefully we can, agree on ways to do this so that there is more overlap between different devices, different OEMs and so on. And then we can have, standards and we can move in that direction.
I believe it was PSD2 that kind of required financial institutions to share their data with third parties, if I'm remembering it correctly. Do you anticipate something similar happening? Could something like PSD2 actually even work? Because you're talking about so many different types of hardware, so many different use cases. We're talking about cars, we're talking about heat pumps, we're talking about solar panels. Could that even work? Or is it going to just be the market figures itself out?
That's a great question. I think certainly it could work. It depends on kind of how granular you want to have a regulation like that. But I think in general, some regulation that's mandating, these devices to be able to play their part in the energy system will benefit everyone. There are already some things in the works, I believe. I think that would be something that's going to be required, and hopefully something that's coming soon.
A couple final questions. One is, Henrik, it would be great to get your point of view on, I know it's not necessarily a utopia by 2030, but the hope is over the course of the next 7 years, we do see a big transformation. By that time, OEM's business model will have completely changed. Utility companies and how they're interacting with consumers, the energy market. We talked a little bit about it before on a previous podcast. It requires market reform. It requires business model reform. It also requires a lot about consumer awareness and change in how they are basically demanding these types of services. So could you maybe paint us a little bit of a picture of what you think 2030 and 2035 might look like from the perspective of an interoperable model or the experience of a consumer within the car, and how you also see kind of Enode playing a role?
One thing that we really need to go towards, I believe at least, is that these things work in the background. So like we're taking away the complexity for the end user. I think it's going to go to the point where you don't have to interact with it at all. And you are also confident as an end user or as a consumer that you're getting the most out of it, right? But it's all kind of happening in the background.
I agree. That makes a lot of sense. A lot of it has to be focused on now automating these projects and these programs so people can interact, I guess, with the energy market as simply as they are doing now. It'll be interesting to see how quickly the technology can ultimately get there. And obviously there'll be some that are further ahead. Could you also maybe talk a little bit about where you see OEMs also in the future? We talk or hear a bit about the beginnings of certain consolidation in the market. There's also new partnerships opening up. So not just vertical consolidation, but also organizations having to expand out their capabilities across horizontals too. So externalizing software development. How do you believe OEM's model will change?
Yeah, I think that's the $1 million question, right? It's very hard to say. And I think there are so many different ways it can play out. There's definitely going to be several EV OEMs who can successfully kind of become an energy management solution for your home. I think that's inevitable.
Yeah, definitely. I agree. This new interface is emerging that didn't exist before. There were previously, all you did, as Kevin was mentioning a little bit before, it is funny. Yeah, the interface is, here's a bill, pay it, off you go.
Exactly. Yeah.
There's a very low level of control and empowerment for consumers and how they're interacting with that market. It's seen as something that's just basically necessary and that's there. So it'll be interesting to see how that evolves. And I quite like your analogy there about Tesla starting to move towards more of this energy management organization type company too. So then, as we like to end every podcast episode, a bit of a myth buster. Henrik, if you were to dispel a myth out in the EV industry, EV charging, purchasing an EVs, whatever it might be, the work that you are centralizing with great technology that you're developing as part of the transition. Yeah, if you were to bust a myth, what would it be?
That's a good question. I think at least one myth that I face sometimes is, or at least what I think is a myth is grid scale storage. So I think there's a perception that in a while, or like in, 5 to 10 years, we're going to have enough grid scale storage that's going to save the day. I think that's very unlikely because when you look at the supply side of battery production over the next decade, it's obviously limited. So we can't produce enough batteries or enough kilowatt hours of batteries. And on the demand side, the ones with the best purchasing power are the EV OEMs. So probably like 80 to 90%, or at least based on, projections that we have today, 80 to 90% of all battery production over the next decade is going to end up in EVs. There's just going to not be enough batteries left to build meaningful grid scale storage, at least in the next decade. We really need to get these EVs into play. That's where we'll have the storage available over the next decade. There's going to be other technologies as well, but I think it's going to be the main bulk of the storage capability is going to be in those EVs.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point to make. Obviously lithium, cobalt, all these materials are, of course, in limited supply. They're going to be produced and put into batteries of EVs, but also not just like commercial vehicles, but also heavy duty vehicles. That requires also a lot of energy capacity to be able to run and train. It's an interesting point of view to say, to really hit widespread adoption, that first needs to go within the transportation sector and not on the grid, potentially diversified in different ways. Great. Cool. So Henrik, that's our show. Thank you very much for joining us. Really appreciated the good discussion. I think we've hit some very good points on the customer, the position they will play, the role of the OEMs. I think also good as well that we started to bring into discussion a little bit of utility. So hopefully you also enjoyed the experience.
Absolutely.
Yeah, really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you guys. That was awesome. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you, Henrik.
In Between Charges is a podcast from Monta, the charging software for all your EV needs.
Thanks for listening. If you want to keep up with the latest news about the show, follow Monta on Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, or Facebook.
And remember, get charged or drive trying.